Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating exploration.
We really are.
We're looking into what happens in our brains during spiritual, maybe mystical experiences.
Exactly. We're using those excerpts you sent from Why God Won't Go Away, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief.
Right. And our mission for you listening is really to unpack the key insights. How is our neurology actually involved in those really profound moments, those feelings that are often, so hard to describe?
Yeah, the ones connected with religious belief or deep spirituality.
We're aiming for those aha moments, basically, giving you a fresh, brain-based way to look at these experiences without hopefully getting bogged down in too much technical jargon.
Definitely. And the material you sent is, well, it's compelling stuff. The authors dive right into that connection, neuroscience, and these very personal, subjective experiences.
And what grabs you right away is how they went about investigating it, right? Their main method.
Yeah, their core methodology.
Okay, so let's get into it. The book talks about using brain imaging, SPECT scans specifically, to see what's happening when people meditate.
That's the one.
Can you walk us through how they did that? They gave that example of Robert, the meditator.
Sure. So they describe this meditator, Robert. First step, he gets an IV line put in. Simple enough.
Okay.
Then, about an hour into his meditation, when he felt he was really reaching that peak state, he'd signal them. Pulled on a string, actually.
Right, okay. Low-tech signal for a high-tech experiment.
Yeah. And at that exact moment, they inject a radioactive tracer into his bloodstream through the AFE.
And this tracer goes where the blood flows most.
Precisely. Neurons working harder need more energy, more blood flow.
Mm.
So the tracer gets carried to the most active brain cells, and it binds pretty quickly. It creates essentially a snapshot of brain activity right at that peak moment.
Like freezing time, neurologically speaking.
Kinda, yeah. After Robert finished meditating, they immediately took him to a room with a SPECT camera.
And the camera sees the tracer.
It detects where that radioactive tracer has gathered. More tracer means more blood flow, which means more activity. So the final images showed exactly which parts of his brain were firing on all cylinders and which were quiet during that peak meditative state.
Wow. So a frozen moment of brain activity, what did these snapshots actually show, especially about that area they named the Orientation Association area, the OAA?
The OAA.
Hmm.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. It's a term the authors coined,
Okay.
and they place it in the posterior superior parietal lobe, so sort of back and up in your brain.
Got it. And its normal job? What does it usually do?
Its main function, normally, is to weave together all the raw sensory info we get, sight, sound, touch, into our perception of ourselves as a distinct individual existing in physical space.
So it helps me know where I end and, like, the chair begins
Well,
and how to move around.
Exactly that. It gives you that fundamental sense of being a self, located here, separate from everything out there.
Makes sense. So what did the SPECT scans show happening in that specific area when Robert was deep in meditation compared to his normal everyday state?
The difference was pretty stark. In Robert's baseline, everyday state, his OAA showed significant activity. Lots of vibrant reds and yellows on the scan images, indicating high blood flow, high activity.
Like a busy defining self.
Right. But when he hit that meditative peak, the OAA showed a really noticeable decrease in activity. The images showed darker areas, cooler colors like greens and blues,
So less blood flow, less neural activity.
suggesting a significant quieting down, a slowing of the neural processing in that specific area, responsible for defining the self and its boundaries.
Wow, literally stilling the part of the brain that makes us feel separate. And how did Robert's own description of his experience line up with this?
That's the crucial link they make. Robert, like many meditators and mystics describe, reported feelings of profound unity, a sense of timelessness, a dissolving of his individual self.
He said something like he felt part of everything.
He did. His words were, "It feels like I am part of everyone and everything in existence." It's that classic mystical feeling of oneness.
Yeah.
And the authors bring in that beautiful analogy from the Hindu Upanishads, individual consciousness, like rivers flowing into the sea, losing their separate identities, becoming one.
So the subjective feeling of merging, losing boundaries.
It seems to directly mirror the objective finding of decreased activity in the OAA, the very brain region that normally maintains that sense of separateness.
It makes you wonder if our everyday sense of me is actively generated by that area.
It certainly suggests that, doesn't it? That our baseline sense of being a bounded self isn't just a given, it's an ongoing neurological process.
And this wasn't just a one-off with Robert Ray. They mentioned looking at other meditators, too.
Exactly. They followed up with a study involving 8 Tibetan Buddhist meditators, all people with, extensive experience, years of practice.
Okay, similar results.
Broadly consistent, yes. They found a similar quieting of activity in that orientation area during the most intense phases of their meditation.
So that strengthens the connection. Less activity in the OAA seems linked to that feeling of unity or transcendence.
It definitely points in that direction. It suggests this neurological shift might be a key component of these profound subjective states.
Okay, so the OAA is critical for our sense of self, and quieting it seems linked to feelings of oneness. Now, the book uses this really interesting analogy, something about a robot trying to navigate a room.
Ah, yes, the robot analogy. It's a fantastic way to highlight just how incredibly complex and, frankly, efficient our own everyday perception really is.
What was the setup?
So they had this robot equipped with basically just a video camera for vision. Very simple input. Its task on it easy, move across a room and open a door.
Seems straightforward enough.
But here's the catch. Even tiny movements by the robot shifting its position slightly change the visual information coming from the camera. Angles change, perceived distances shift.
Okay, like when we walk around in objects, our view changes constantly.
Precisely. But for the robot, with its very limited programming, each slightly different visual input was interpreted as if it were seeing a completely new, unfamiliar reality.
You couldn't tell it was the same room, just seen from a different spot.
Exactly. It lacked the ability to integrate those slightly different views into a coherent, stable perception of the same environment. So its processing system had to basically start over from scratch with every little movement.
Which must have made it incredibly slow.
Painfully slow. They said something simple like navigating around a desk could take ages because it was constantly reassessing a brand new world. It really highlights how much processing our brains do automatically, totally beneath our awareness.
So the robot's struggle really throws into relief what our brains achieve effortlessly. How does this connect back to perception and those association areas we were talking about?
Well, the contrast is the key point. Unlike the robot, our brains are constantly taking in a massive flood of data from all our senses simultaneously: sight, sound, touch, smell. Yet we don't experience the world as a chaotic series of disconnected snapshots like the robot did. Our brains seamlessly integrate all this incoming information. They build a stable, continuous, and meaningful perception of the world around us.
And the association areas are key to that integration.
Absolutely. The authors stress their role. Areas like the OAA and others don't just process one sense. They take raw data, integrate it with information from other senses, and also link it with our memories, our expectations, our emotional state.
So it's not just seeing a chair, it's recognizing that chair, knowing you can sit on it, maybe remembering you bought it last year.
Precisely. That whole rich, layered understanding, it allows us to recognize that even when our viewpoint shifts slightly, we're still in the same room, dealing with the same objects. The robot just couldn't do that sophisticated cross-referencing and integration.
It makes you appreciate the constant background work our brain is doing just to give us a stable reality. It's incredible.
It really is.
Now, let's shift perspective a bit. The book also touches on the evolution of the brain. How does that long journey relate to our ability to perceive things so well?
Yeah, they give a really neat overview. They trace nervous system evolution from really simple organisms like a flatworm, which only has a few hundred nerve cells.
Wow, that's basic.
Incredibly basic. All the way up, of course, to the human brain with its billions of interconnected neurons. And the clear trend across that vast timescale is a massive increase in complexity.
And more complexity means better perception.
Generally, yes. Increased complexity allows organisms to perceive their environment with much greater precision, much more nuance, and crucially, it allows for a wider, more flexible, more adaptive range of responses and behaviors.
So we go from just simple approach food, avoid danger reactions.
To incredibly sophisticated levels of understanding, planning, and interacting with the world. In primitive organisms, you might just have simple nerve chains giving a very basic interpretation of reality.
Like on-off switches almost.
Kind of. But as you move up, these structures get longer, more intricate. You get clusters of neurons forming specialized processing centers. The sheer number of nerve cells explodes.
And they start talking to each other more.
Exactly. Connecting circuits develop, allowing different specialized areas to share information. integrate it. This leads to richer, multi-layered perceptions and much more effective ways of navigating and adapting to whatever the environment throws at you.
And the human brain is sort of the current peak of that complexity. What specific parts do they highlight in that evolutionary story?
They put a lot of emphasis on the cerebral cortex, the outer wrinkly layer, and specifically the neocortex, the newest part, evolutionarily speaking.
That's the bit that makes us human, essentially.
It's strongly associated with the higher order cognitive functions that really distinguish us. Things like complex language, abstract thought, art, creating myths, building cultures. A lot of that capability resides in the neocortex.
And they mention the left and right hemispheres, too.
Briefly, yes. They touch on the general association's left hemisphere, often linked with analytical processing, language, right, with more holistic visual spatial stuff and emotions. But they're quick to emphasize it's not a rigid division.
They work together mostly.
In almost all real-world tasks, they're highly interconnected and cooperative. It's more nuanced than the simple pop psychology view.
Okay, so how does the brain actually build these complex perceptions from scratch, from the raw sensory input?
It's a multi-stage process, quite intricate. It all starts with those tiny bursts of electrochemical energy nerve impulses picked up by our sense organs, eyes, ears, skin.
Right, the raw data feed.
These impulses travel along specific nerve pathways into the brain. The first cortical stop is usually the primary receptive areas, each dedicated to a specific sense: vision, hearing, touch, etc.
So raw visual data goes to the primary visual cortex.
Exactly. And there the data is assembled into very basic preliminary perceptions. Think initial lines, shapes, colors for vision. Very crude.
Like the first sketch.
Good analogy. Then this initial pattern gets passed on to the secondary receptive areas. Here, it's refined, organized into more recognizable forms and patterns.
Okay, so the lines and shapes start looking like an object.
Maybe starting to resemble something familiar. Finally, this more processed information reaches the association areas like the OAA we discussed, and others like the visual association area or auditory association area.
And this is where it all comes together.
This is where the magic happens, you could say. Information from one sense gets integrated with input from all the other senses. Plus, these areas have strong links to memory centers and emotional centers, like the limbic system.
So it adds context, meaning, feeling.
Exactly. It creates those rich, multidimensional perceptions that form the bedrock of our conscious experience. It lets us understand the world and respond to it in a comprehensive, personally relevant way.
They used that poodle example to walk through this, didn't they? Can you remind us how that illustrated the process?
Oh yeah, the poodle example is great for this. So imagine you see a poodle. The initial electrochemical signals hit your primary visual cortex.
Just raw light patterns.
Pretty much. Abstract lines, shapes, maybe patches of black or white. You're
Yep.
not consciously aware of this stage. Then it moves to the secondary visual cortex.
Okay.
Here, those elements start getting organized. Maybe into a form you'd recognize as small, furry animal, curly hair. You might become aware of something dog-like, but it's still pretty basic.
Right. Not that specific poodle yet.
Exactly. The real identification and understanding happens in the visual association area. Here, that visual pattern of poodle gets integrated.
With what? Other senses? Memories?
All the above. Maybe the olfactory areas chip in the familiar dog smell. Auditory areas might recall barking sounds. Critically, memory areas access your past experiences. Maybe you owned a poodle, maybe you were bitten by one.
So emotion comes into play too.
Big time. Emotional areas linked to the association cortex will color the perception. Affection if you love dogs. Maybe unease or fear if you've had bad experiences. It's this final integration in the association areas that transforms raw input into a meaningful, emotionally tagged perception of that poodle.
It's just incredible how many steps are involved, all happening instantly, just to recognize a dog.
Totally unconscious, most of it.
Now, the book also brings up another key player, the attention association area, the AAA. Where's that and what's its job?
Okay, the AAA. That's basically your prefrontal cortex right at the very front of your brain, behind the forehead.
The executive suite.
You could call it that. It plays a huge role in guiding complex, goal-oriented actions and behaviors. Planning the steps to beginner, figuring out a problem.
So managing tasks.
Yes, but also on a more internal level. It's critical for focusing your mind, directing your attention towards a specific thought, idea, or object, and holding it there.
Like when you're trying hard to concentrate.
Exactly. Because it's so central to intentional focus and action. The authors mention some researchers even call it the neurological seat of the will.
Seat of the will. That's powerful. How does this area help us actually focus, given all the noise and distraction in the world?
They talk about the concept of redundancy here, which sounds a bit negative, but it's more about the brain's amazing filtering ability.
Filtering out the unimportant stuff.
Precisely. The AAA helps the brain screen out irrelevant sensory input, ignore distractions, and maintain concentration on whatever your current goal is. It's what lets you read a book in a noisy cafe or focus on a conversation.
Like mental noise-canceling headphones.
That's a great way to put it. It allows you to allocate your mental resources effectively.
And did they see anything interesting happening in the AAA during those peak meditative or spiritual states we talked about?
Well, the data here is apparently quite limited. Capturing these deep states in a lab is notoriously difficult, right?
Yeah, they're unpredictable.
So they mention only one reported EE reading that measures electrical activity taken during a near-peak experience.
And what did that one reading show?
Interestingly, it showed significant changes in electrical activity in both the attention association area, AAA, and the orientation association area, OAA, during that moment of intense concentration.
Both. So intense focus and that shift in self-perception might be happening together.
That single data point suggests that, yes, it hints that maybe a highly focused state of attention, managed by the AAA, could be related to or perhaps even help induce the altered sense of self linked to the OAA changes. But again, it's limited data.
Intriguing, though. Okay, so we've covered how the brain perceives the world, focuses attention, but then there's the really big one. How does the brain become aware of itself, the emergence of mind?
Yeah, that's a deep end of the pool, isn't it? The authors call this a truly remarkable step in evolution. This incredibly complex organ, the brain, somehow developed the capacity to perceive its own existence.
Leading to self-awareness, consciousness, what we call mind.
Exactly. Our inner world, thoughts, feelings, sensations, the feeling of being me, and they're upfront about it. Current science can't fully explain how something that feels non-material, like our mind, arises from the purely biological, physical stuff of the brain.
That classic mind-body problem. Still a huge challenge.
Absolutely. For science, for philosophy, it's a fundamental mystery.
So how do the authors handle it in the book? Do they define mind and brain?
They offer some working definitions, which are helpful. They define the brain as the physical hardware, the structures that gather, process, store all that sensory, cognitive, emotional data.
Okay, the biological machine.
And they define mind as the subjective experience that arises from all that processing, the thoughts, the memories, the feelings, the phenomenal awareness itself.
So mind is what the brain does, or what emerges from its activity.
That's the strong implication. They really emphasize the intimate, inseparable link between the two. They suggest mind and brain are basically two sides of the same coin, two ways of looking at the same fundamental entity.
They used an analogy for this, right? Something about a wave.
Yes, the wave analogy. It's quite elegant. They compare the mind-brain relationship to a wave in the ocean.
How so?
Well, a wave needs the water, obviously, but it also needs the energy moving through the water to give it its form and motion. You can't really separate the physical water from the dynamic energy and still have what we call a wave.
Okay, they're intrinsically linked.
Right. And they argue it's similar for mind and brain. You can't neatly separate the individual neurons and their electrochemical activity, the water, from the resulting thoughts and feelings, the energy or form.
Because the thoughts are the activity, in a sense.
That's the idea. If you could separate them, they argue, then maybe a thought could exist without its neural basis. The mind could potentially be separate from the brain, maybe like a soul in some traditions.
But they don't think that's plausible based on the neuroscience.
Given the sheer interconnectedness and constant dynamic activity of the brain, the idea of isolating a thought from its underlying complex neural pattern seems practically impossible to them. So their conclusion is, mind needs brain. Brain generates mind. They're fundamentally intertwined aspects of one reality.
The wave needs the water and the energy. That really helps clarify their perspective. Now, shifting gears again slightly, they also get into altered states of consciousness. How do these connect to our nervous system, specifically the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches?
Right, the autonomic nervous system. They lay out a framework based on how these two branches interact. You've got the arousal system, the sympathetic branch, often called fight or flight,
It's you revved up.
and the quiescent system, the parasympathetic, the rest and digest branch.
Calms you down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they describe 4 basic states of interaction between these two. First, just normal interaction, the everyday balance.
Okay.
Then you can have hyperquiescence, where the calming system is unusually dominant.
Okay.
or hyperarousal, where the excitatory system takes over completely.
Like extreme relaxation or extreme stress.
Sort of. But then there are the two states they link most closely to, altered, sometimes mystical experiences.
Which are
Hyperquiescence with arousal breakthrough and hyperarousal with quiescent breakthrough.
okay, those sound paradoxical. Can you break them down? What triggers them?
Let's take hyperquiescence with arousal breakthrough first. This happens when the calming system, parasympathetic, becomes so intensely active that it kind of overwhelms the usual checks and balances. Instead of just damping down arousal, it paradoxically triggers a surge of excitation from the arousal system at the same time.
So deep, calm, and high energy simultaneously.
Exactly. It sounds weird, but think about experiences triggered by deep meditation or intense contemplative prayer. People often report profound bliss absorption, but also sometimes an exhilarating rush of energy, feeling totally absorbed yet intensely alive.
Like being in the zone, but on a much deeper level.
That might be a taste of it, yeah.
Yeah.
That feeling of losing boundaries, being totally focused yet filled with intense positive feeling.
Okay. And the other one, hyperarousal with quiescent breakthrough.
That's kind of the flip side. This happens when the arousal system, sympathetic, is maximally stimulated maybe through intense, prolonged concentration or repetitive rhythmic activities like ritualistic dancing.
Right. Things that really push the system.
And this extreme arousal causes a kind of spillover effect, triggering a sudden, powerful activation of the calming, quiescent system,
So extreme excitement leads to sudden, deep calm.
often experienced as a trance-like state, an ecstatic rush, sometimes even described using orgasmic terms. It can be induced by intense focus, chanting, dancing, and they also briefly note it can occur during sexual climax.
Wow. So these intense states, bliss, ecstasy, seem to involve this unusual simultaneous firing of both the on and off switches of our nervous system.
That's the model they propose, yes. A kind of temporary extreme state where the normal opposition breaks down.
And how do our emotions fit into this picture? Where do they come from in these states?
Well, clearly these altered states are usually highly emotional experiences, right? Profound bliss, ecstasy, sometimes fear or awe.
Definitely.
So the authors argue the autonomic nervous system must work very closely with the limbic system, the brain's main emotional processing network.
Makes sense.
They specifically point to the hypothalamus. They call it the master control for the autonomic nervous system. And it's also crucial for generating our basic raw emotions, everything from rage and terror to deep pleasure and bliss.
So the hypothalamus is linking the nervous system state to the emotional feeling.
It seems to be a key hub, yes. And they also mention other limbic structures briefly, the amygdala, which helps tag experiences with emotional significance and direct our attention.
Tells us what's important emotionally.
Right. And the hippocampus, which is involved in modulating emotions, linking them to memories, and also regulating our overall arousal levels. So it's this complex interplay between the autonomic system and various parts of the limbic system that shapes the intense emotional quality of these altered states.
It's fascinating how interconnected it all is. The sense of self, attention, nervous system states, emotion, all playing a role.
It really paints a picture of the brain as this incredibly dynamic, integrated system.
This has truly been a deep dive, pulling together a lot of complex ideas. To try and wrap this up, can you summarize the main takeaways from our exploration of why God won't go away? What are the key points?
Absolutely. I think, first off, the book makes a strong case that experiences we often label as spiritual or mystical do seem to have specific neurological correlates. Things are happening in the brain that align with these subjective reports.
It's not just all in the mind in some vague sense, but potentially tied to specific brain functions.
Exactly. The orientation association area, OAA, seems particularly important that decreased activity lining up with feelings of unity and loss of self-boundaries is a really compelling piece of evidence they present.
Right, the SPECT scan findings.
Then there's the robot analogy. It does a brilliant job illustrating just how sophisticated and efficient our everyday perception is, and how crucial those association areas are for creating our stable sense of reality.
Which we totally take for granted.
Completely. And looking at the brain's evolution really underscores its incredible journey toward complex understanding, eventually leading to self-awareness, the emergence of mind.
And finally, the altered states.
That model of the autonomic nervous system, hyperquiescence with arousal breakthrough, hyperarousal with quiescent breakthrough, provides a potential physiological mechanism for understanding those intense states of bliss, ecstasy, and transcendence, reported across so many cultures and traditions, linked strongly through the limbic system to our emotions.
So, a lot of different threads converging on how the brain might underpin these experiences.
I think that's a fair summary.
And for you listening to this, what's the value here? Why should the scientific perspective on spiritual feelings be compelling or interesting?
Well, I think this deep dive offers a really fascinating scientific lens. Maybe a new way to think about experiences that can feel very personal, maybe even ineffable. It suggests our brains might actually be, in a sense, wired in ways that can facilitate these feelings, transcendence, unity, deep insight.
So, it's not taking away the mystery, perhaps, but adding another layer of understanding.
Exactly. It provides a potential framework for understanding these moments not just as purely abstract or spiritual phenomena, but as experiences that also have a tangible biological basis in how our incredibly complex brains work.
Which could maybe make us appreciate our own consciousness even more.
Perhaps. It might suggest these profound states are maybe more accessible or fundamentally human than we sometimes think. So for you, if you've had moments of deep connection, awe, or insight, this research offers a possible glimpse into the neurological underpinnings of what might have been happening inside you.
That's a fantastic point. It's about gaining perspective. So, maybe the final thought for everyone to chew on.
Go for it.
Consider how this understanding that our brains have specific mechanisms potentially related to these profound experiences. How might that subtly shift your perspective
Mm.
on spirituality, on consciousness itself, maybe even on the nature of reality?
Mm.
Could this capacity for self-transcendence seemingly built into our neural architecture be a fundamental part of being human, with implications that maybe go beyond just our own individual feelings?
That's definitely something to ponder, a lot to think about.
It certainly is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.